She was nobody. A foreign graduate student with ink-stained fingers and a half-finished dissertation, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and in 30 seconds, the most feared man in Seoul was going to claim her as his future wife in front of 500 witnesses, 200 camera lenses, and every criminal organization watching from the shadows. She hadn't agreed. He hadn't asked. And the moment his hand closed around hers on that stage, both their lives cracked open like fault lines before an earthquake. And nothing, not the contract, not the lies, not the blood that came after, would ever put them back the way they were. If you've ever loved someone you were forbidden to love, stay until the very end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The gala had been running for 3 hours before anything went wrong. That was the thing about catastrophe in this city. It never announced itself. It didn't build with swelling music or a visible countdown. It arrived the way winter did in Seoul. One moment the air was manageable, the next it was inside your lungs and you couldn't remember ever being warm. Imani Brooks had not been invited. She knew that. She had known it when she'd slipped through the service entrance behind a catering truck, flashing the volunteer badge she'd borrowed from her roommate, Min Ji, who had bailed at the last minute with a stomach bug and a text that said, "Sorry, you owe me dinner." She had known it when she'd spent 40 minutes in the employee bathroom pressing her one decent black dress flat with her palms because she hadn't owned a working iron in 8 months. She'd known it when she walked into the Grand Mirai ballroom and felt the immediate cellular difference between people who belonged in rooms like this and people who were merely inside them. She was the latter. She had always been the latter. But she was also 27 years old and writing her dissertation on corporate philanthropy and criminal capital redirection in East Asia. And Park Soo-jin, the director of the Haewon Charitable Foundation, who had promised to grant Imani a sit-down interview 3 months ago and had been ghosting her ever since. Park Soo-jin was standing 40 feet away near the champagne display, laughing with 2 men in tuxedos and clearly having a wonderful evening that she intended to have without Imani Brooks anywhere near it. So, here they were. Imani took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray because holding something made her look like she was supposed to be somewhere. And she began to move through the crowd with the particular kind of careful invisibility she had spent years perfecting. She was good at it. She had learned it the way most people learn necessary survival skills. Not in a classroom, not from a book, but from the accumulated weight of being the only black woman in enough rooms that you either learned to move through space differently or you spent your whole life exhausted from the friction. She kept her shoulders back, her face composed. She smiled at no one and everyone simultaneously, the way the catering staff did, the way the coat check attendants did. The smile that said, "I am performing a function in this space, and you need not engage with me directly." It worked, mostly. The Grand Mirai was one of those buildings that spent more on the concept of itself than on anything structural. The ballroom ceiling was a cathedral of gold-veined marble and recessed lighting that made everyone look slightly more important than they were. Every table had fresh white peonies and candles in crystal holders. The floor was the kind of polish that reflected your feet back up at you. And Imani had spent the first 10 minutes being subtly unsettled by the ghost version of herself moving beneath her shoes. The charity being honored tonight was the Seoram Children's Fund, and the walls were hung with enormous photographs of the work. Classrooms built in rural communities, medical vans, smiling children in matching yellow raincoats outside what appeared to be a newly constructed community center. Imani had spent enough time researching the intersection of philanthropic capital and organized criminal enterprise to know that clean images could coat almost anything. But she also knew that sometimes clean images were simply what they appeared to be, and that the work, regardless of the hands funding it, reached the children either way. She was still turning that particular moral knot in her mind when she spotted Park Soo-jin separating from the 2 tuxedos, glancing at her phone, and heading toward the far corridor, probably toward the restrooms, probably alone for 60 seconds. Imani moved. She was fast when she needed to be, not aggressive. She'd learned that aggression in spaces like this read differently on her than it did on others, and she didn't have the energy tonight for whatever scene that might create. She was simply purposeful. She angled through a gap between a cluster of older men comparing watches and a younger couple who were clearly furious at each other and expressing it through synchronized staring at the centerpiece. Dr. Park, the woman slowed, turned. She had the particular expression of someone locating an appointment they'd forgotten making. Not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the bureaucratic middle. "I'm Amani Brooks," Amani said, keeping her voice low and even. "We've spoken by email. I'm researching philanthropic structures for my dissertation at Yonsei. You generously agreed to an interview in March, and I know your schedule is extraordinarily—" "Ms. Brooks?" Park Soo-jin's expression did not exactly warm. It calibrated. "Tonight is not— this isn't really the setting for— I know, I apologize for the venue, but I've sent 14 emails and— 14. The woman's mouth did something complicated. "I'm aware." "Then you know I'm persistent, and you know I'm not going away. Which means the most efficient resolution is 20 minutes of your time at a location of your choosing, so I can finish my chapter and you can stop receiving my emails." Amani paused. "And I'm very sorry about the venue. I had a badge." For a moment, Park Soo-jin simply looked at her. Then something in her face unlocked. Not respect exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a certain kind of stubbornness that she understood. "Tuesday," she said. 2:00. My assistant will confirm by Monday." "Thank you," Amani said, and meant it down to her sternum. Park Soo-jin moved on. Amani exhaled. She turned back toward the ballroom and allowed herself 30 seconds of pure private relief. The kind you couldn't show in the moment because showing it would retroactively make you look like you hadn't expected to succeed, which would retroactively make you look like you hadn't deserved to. She was recalibrating, finding the nearest exit, calculating how quickly she could get out of this dress and back to her apartment and the cold rice she'd left in the cooker when the light shifted. It happened fast. The general ambient buzz of 500 people networking lowered itself without instruction, the way crowds sometimes did when the air pressure changed. Some collective animal instinct detecting that something was about to require attention. Amani turned, following the unconscious choreography of the room, and saw the stage at the far end of the ballroom light up with a crispness that changed the temperature of everything. 3 men walked up the stage steps. She recognized 2 of them from her research, Shin Beom-seok, the current director of Seorim Children's Fund, and a deputy minister whose name she couldn't immediately pull. The third man she recognized from something else entirely, from the particular way her chest tightened when she saw him, from the half-dozen photographs she'd found in her research buried deep in financial forensics databases, and one particularly detailed investigative piece in an independent Korean journal that had mysteriously lost its domain 6 weeks after publication. Kang Tae-hyun was 34 years old and looked exactly like what he was, and nothing like what he was simultaneously. He was tall in the way that wasn't about raw height, but about the arrangement of space around a person. How some people simply took up more room than their measurements suggested. How a room reorganized its attention around them before anyone made a conscious decision to look. He wore a black tuxedo with the particular ease of a man who had not worn it to impress anyone, including himself. His face was angular and controlled, the jaw set with the kind of stillness that in other contexts would read as calm, and in this one read as something more like the quiet at the center of a compressed mechanism. Imani knew who he was. She had known for nearly a year since she'd stumbled across a financial thread in a philanthropic database that had led, through 17 degrees of corporate separation, to a holding entity that appeared to have no legitimate origin story. She had pulled that thread in her dissertation research and found, not evidence exactly, nothing that would hold in a court or a published paper, but the shape of something enormous and deliberate operating just below the surface of the city's charitable infrastructure. She had no evidence that Kang Tae-hyun ran the Black Phoenix Syndicate. She had considerable circumstantial architecture suggesting that someone with his access, his capital movement patterns, and his particular fingerprint on certain anonymous foundation grants had been quietly reshaping how criminal capital moved through Seoul's nonprofit sector for the better part of a decade. She had never been able to confirm it. She'd never been able to confirm it because every time she got close to a source, the source went quiet. And every time she found a document that might help, the document was no longer available. And every time she thought she had something solid, the solid thing turned out to be standing on sand. She should not be looking at him. She looked at him anyway. Shin Beom-seok was speaking. Something about the fund's goals for the coming year, something about community impact metrics, something Imani would normally have been transcribing with her phone under the table. She wasn't transcribing anything. She was watching Kang Tae-hyun stand at the edge of the stage with his hands at his sides and his expression giving away precisely nothing, and she was wondering, not for the first time, what it would take to make that face move. The answer arrived before she had finished forming the question, because that was how catastrophe worked in Seoul. A woman's voice cut through the speech from somewhere to Imani's left, sharp and surgical, designed to carry. Yura told me everything. The crowd didn't go silent. It went something worse. It went careful. The way a body goes careful when it registers pain before the brain has processed the location. The woman was young, maybe 25, dressed in dark red with the slightly unfocused eyes of someone running on adrenaline and a decision made before the emotion behind it had fully arrived. She was holding a phone with the screen facing out, and even from across the ballroom, Imani could see that the screen was displaying photographs. She couldn't see what the photographs showed. She didn't need to. The collective intake of breath around her calibrated her immediately. He has been sleeping with Yura for 2 years. The woman's voice cracked on the last word but didn't break. She showed me the messages. She showed me everything. And she would be standing here saying this herself, except he threatened her. He told her what would happen to her family if she... Shin Byung-seok had gone the color of old concrete. The deputy minister had taken a half step back. The murmur rising through the crowd had the particular frequency of damage, of the kind of story that was going to be everywhere by morning, the kind that didn't need to be verified to be believed, the kind that attached itself to a name and didn't let go. Imani had been researching enough corporate and criminal structures to know what a targeted exposure looked like. She also knew what a genuinely betrayed woman looked like, and the one in the dark red dress was the second thing. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that 3 people from the crowd near the stage entrance had begun moving with a direction and a speed that had nothing casual in it. The problem was that Imani, having unconsciously repositioned herself during the speech to get a better angle on Kang Tae-hyun's expression, was now standing in precisely the wrong place, between the moving men and the woman in red, in the narrow corridor of open floor that the crowd had instinctively vacated. The problem was that one of the men said something in Korean, low and short, clearly intended to land on the woman without the crowd catching it, and from the woman's face it landed like a fist. And the problem was that Imani, who had very good instincts and very poor impulse control when those instincts identified something unjust, stepped directly into the path of the closest man before she had made a conscious choice to do so. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice came out even. She was almost impressed. The man stopped. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in what was clearly an expensive suit, with the particular blankness of someone who had been trained to not express things. He looked at her the way you'd look at a chair that had moved itself. "I don't think she's finished," Imani said. A bad idea. She knew it was a bad idea. She knew it the way you knew stepping onto ice that sounds wrong is a bad idea. Before your foot had committed, you already knew, and your foot went anyway. The man's expression didn't change. That was worse than if it had. "Ms. Brooks?" The voice came from behind her, and Imani's entire nervous system reorganized itself in the half-second before she turned, because the voice was close, closer than it should have been given that the man it belonged to had been on a stage 40 feet away 12 seconds ago. And it was low and it was precise, and it said her name with the certainty of someone who had known it for considerably longer than this moment. Kang Tae-hyun was standing 2 feet behind her. Up close, the face was not more handsome, not more frightening, just more present. The eyes were dark and still, and they were on her with a focus that she'd only ever seen turned toward financial spreadsheets and architectural blueprints in the late-night research hours when she was working through a problem she hadn't yet solved. He was looking at her the way you looked at something you were trying to understand before you decided what to do with it. He reached out and took her hand, not roughly, not performatively. He did it the way you'd move a glass away from the edge of a table, efficiently, before it fell. Then he turned to face the room. "I apologize," he said, and his voice carried without effort, the way voices did when the person speaking had never needed to raise them to be heard. "My fiancée has strong convictions. It's one of the things I admire most about her." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Imani had ever experienced. Fiancé. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Concentric rings spreading outward, touching everything, changing the surface of everything it reached. She could feel the crowd recalibrating in real time. She could feel the three men recalibrating. She could feel, most acutely, the specific micro-expression on Shin Byom-seok's face, which had shifted from panicked to calculating in the time it took the word to finish landing. Kang Tae-hyun's hand was warm. She hadn't expected that. She didn't know what she'd expected. Maybe nothing, because she hadn't expected this to be happening at all. But warmth hadn't been part of any projection. He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were steady and unreadable, and carrying something in their depths that might have been an apology or might have been a warning, and she understood in that moment that she had approximately 3 seconds to decide whether to confirm what he'd just said or to contradict it in front of 500 people, 200 camera lenses, and whatever was behind those three men's stillness. She looked at the woman in the red dress who had gone quiet, whose phone was now at her side. Who was watching Kang Tae-hyun with an expression that Imani couldn't decode from this distance, but that read like fear modulated by something older and more complicated than fear. She looked at the three men who had stopped moving. She looked back at Kang Tae-hyun. "Next time," she said in English, quietly enough that only he could hear it, "warn me first." Then she turned to the room and let her hand stay in his, and did not say anything else, and that silence was its own confirmation. The event did not recover its prior rhythm. These things never did. But it reorganized itself around the new information with the particular efficiency of a social ecosystem adapting to a changed landscape, and within 15 minutes, the murmuring had shifted from the woman in red to the foreign woman in black standing beside Kang Tae-hyun, and the photographs on the phone had been largely forgotten in the metabolic restructuring of who the most interesting story now was. Tae-hyun did not let go of her hand for 2 hours. He introduced her to 6 people during that time. He said her name correctly every time. He translated when she needed it and stepped back when she didn't, and never once looked at her with the expression she'd been bracing for. The expression that would have said, "This is temporary, you're a prop, do not misunderstand your function here." He looked at her with something more neutral and more attentive than that. The expression of someone learning the dimensions of a space they had unexpectedly decided to enter. She didn't ask questions during the gala. She was too busy performing the particular kind of composed confidence that the situation required, and performance of that caliber required all available processing power. But she cataloged. She always cataloged. She cataloged the way the room reorganized itself around him, not with the fawning deference of people performing admiration, but with the careful spatial awareness of people who understood that proximity to him came with an invisible weight. She cataloged the 2 men who stayed within 20 feet of him at all times and never looked at him directly, which meant they were security and good security. She cataloged the way Shin Byom-seok approached them near the end of the evening, smoothly, smiling with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned to smile at dangerous things, and the way Tae-hyun's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around hers before Byom-seok was within earshot. She cataloged the fact that his hand was still warm. They left together because there was no architecture for leaving separately. The car was black and immaculate and large enough that there was genuine physical distance between them on the back seat, which Imani used to look at her hands and breathe. The driver didn't exist in the way that good drivers didn't exist, fully present, fully absent. "You know my name," she said finally. "Yes." "From?" Tae-hyun looked out to the window at the city moving past. Seoul at 11 p.m. was still entirely awake, all light and pressure and motion, the kind of city that didn't have an off switch, that simply ran at different intensities. "You've been pulling financial threads that come close to things I prefer to keep unexamined," he said. "You're thorough, and you're careful, which is more unusual than thoroughness." Imani absorbed this. "You've been watching me. Monitoring. It's different. I'm not sure it is." He turned from the window then and looked at her directly, and she made herself hold the look because she'd been training herself to hold difficult things without flinching for long enough that it had become reflex. "You stepped into the path of one of Shin Byom-seok's men tonight," he said. "Why?" "Because he was going to say something to that woman that she didn't deserve to have said in front of 500 people." "You don't know that. I know how men like that move." A pause. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would have read from a distance, but up close, in the car, she saw it. Something that might have been assessment, or might have been something closer to recognition. "What was your calculation," he said, "when you decided to step in front of him?" "My calculation was that it was wrong, and I could stop it, She looked at him steadily. What was your calculation when you called me your fiancé in front of 500 people? The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was the place a smile might have been if circumstances were different. The same as yours, he said, that it was the fastest way to stop something wrong from continuing. Except my wrong was one man threatening one woman and your wrong was… She stopped. Say it, he said. Not a challenge, closer to permission. I don't have enough confirmed data to say it accurately. She looked back at her hands. But I have enough to know that what you stopped tonight wasn't just one woman's public humiliation, and that whatever you started by calling me your fiancé is larger and more complicated than one evening. He didn't answer immediately. The city moved past them in streaks of light. I need 3 days to resolve the immediate organizational consequences of what happened tonight, he said finally. During those 3 days, you need to not be alone. Amani looked at him. Because you stepped in front of one of Shin Byum-seok's men and then stood beside me for 2 hours being photographed. By morning, those photographs will have circulated. Byum-seok will conclude that your intervention was not coincidental. He will want to understand what you know and who you work for. He paused. He is not a man who asks those questions gently. Amani's mouth went dry. She did not show it. And your solution to that? I have a house. It's secure. You would have your own space. Your research materials can be brought there. He looked at her with that same level attention that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he looked at things, fully, without softening. 3 days. 3 days, she repeated. And then we discuss what this situation actually requires, both of us, with full information. She thought about her apartment. She thought about her dissertation. She thought about the 14 emails to Park Soo-jin and the interview scheduled for Tuesday, and the chapter she needed to finish, and the cold rice in the cooker that she was now definitely not going home to tonight. She thought about the look on the woman in red's face when Tae-hyun's voice had cut through the room, the way the 3 men had stopped moving. She thought about the fact that she had been researching the financial architecture around Kong Tae-hyun for 11 months and had never, not once, found evidence that his philanthropic fingerprint had caused harm. She thought about the warmth of his hand. Full information, she said. No negotiating down from that. Agreed. She nodded once. Outside, the city kept moving. The house was not what she'd expected, which she recognized immediately as a function of having expected something specific. She'd expected fortress. She'd expected the visible vocabulary of criminal power, the kind of excess that announced itself, that said, look at what I've accumulated, the kind of wealth that was performance and security measure simultaneously. The house was large, undeniably, quietly large, but it was not performing anything. It sat behind walls that were high enough to be functional without being theatrical. The architecture was modern but not cold, with the particular kind of restraint that costs more than ostentation because it requires you to know exactly what you want and trust it without decoration. The gardens she could see from the car window were severe and well kept. No fountains. No statement. Inside, a woman named Mrs. O met them at the door. Mid-50s, efficient, with the look of someone who had decided long ago that the number of things worth showing surprise at was very small. She showed Amani to a room on the 2nd floor. The room was clean and spare and had a desk positioned near a window that looked east. Imani stood in the center of it for a moment after Mrs. O left, her dress still on, her single glass of sparkling water from the gala still in her system, the whole evening pressing against the inside of her skull like a sound too loud to locate. She had just agreed to stay in the house of a man she believed, with reasonable circumstantial confidence, ran one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in South Korea. For 3 days. Minimum. Because he'd called her his fiancée in front of 500 people, and now the organization that wanted her silent had a clear photograph of her face standing beside his. She sat on the edge of the bed. Then she stood up, found her phone, and typed Minji a text that said, I'm safe, don't worry, long story, I'll explain when I can. Do not talk to anyone about the badge. She didn't explain. She couldn't. Not yet. The explanation required information she didn't have yet, and she'd trained herself long enough to know that talking before you had the full shape of a thing only meant you'd have to walk back whatever you'd said when the full shape arrived. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed about the photographs on the walls of the gala. The children in yellow raincoats, the community center, the medical vans. She dreamed about the financial thread that had started her research 11 months ago, the one that had led her through 17 degrees of corporate separation to an anonymous foundation that had, in the year she was 16 and her mother was dying of something the family couldn't afford to treat, paid a medical bill so large that the number had rewritten Imani's understanding of what was possible, what could be reversed, what kind of stranger might reach through the dark without ever showing their face. She'd never traced that donation. She'd tried, once, and the trail had gone cold at a holding company registered in 3 different countries simultaneously. She'd stopped trying because some things that arrived as gifts were less useful as mysteries solved, and more useful as reminders that the world was capable of something generous on an anonymous Tuesday. She dreamed about the warmth of his hand. In the morning, she woke to the sound of the city and the smell of coffee from somewhere below, and for one clean second before she remembered where she was and why, she was simply a person waking up in a quiet room with east-facing light. Then she remembered. She was pulling her hair back and calculating how to get to her apartment for clothes and back here before anyone had reason to track her movement when a knock came at the door. Precise. 2 strikes. Waiting. She opened it. Taehyun was dressed already. Dark slacks and a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. No tie, no performance. He was holding a phone. His face carried the controlled stillness that she was beginning to catalog as his default state. But underneath it, this morning, there was something with more edge in it. 3 things, he said. First, your university has terminated your research assistant position, effective this morning. The official reason cited is conduct unbecoming, based on reports from attendees at last night's gala identifying you as an interloper who used a fraudulent badge. Imani said nothing. Her jaw was tight. Second, there are photographs from last night on 4 major Korean news sites and 2 international ones. In all of them, you are beside me. The captions use the word fiancé. 2 of the articles contain your name and your university affiliation. She breathed through her nose. Third, he said, and something shifted in his voice, something that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite anything she had a clean name for. I have a proposal. It requires significantly more than 3 days. And before I make it, I want to be clear about something. She waited. What happened last night, he said. I did to protect you from an immediate threat. I did it without your consent, and I did it knowing it would cost you things I didn't have the right to decide you could afford to lose. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking you to hear the proposal because I believe it's the only architecture that protects both of us from what comes next. Imani looked at him for a long moment. The east light was doing something to the room that made everything very clear. How long? She said. 1 month. She felt the number land. A contract, he said. Formal. Covering your protections, your financial security, your right to exit under specific conditions. Your research and your dissertation would be unimpeded. I can arrange materials and academic access that would advance your work significantly. The position at the university can be replaced with something more substantive. And in return you appear beside me as my fiancé for 1 month. Long enough to stabilize the organizational situation that last night created. Long enough for the rival parties to conclude that the marriage is genuine and that destabilizing me through threatening you is not a productive avenue. He said it plainly. No softening. She'd asked for full information, and this was it. Imani looked at the city through the east window. Seoul in the morning was a different animal than Seoul at night. More industrial, more honest, the bones showing through the light. 1 condition, she said. Name it. She turned to look at him. Whatever this is, whatever the full shape of your organization is, what it does, how it operates, what you are. I'm not going to look away from it. I don't lie to myself about what I'm part of. If I'm going to stand beside you for a month, I need to be standing beside what you actually are, not the version you want me to present in public. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not discomfort, not quite calculation. Something that was older and more personal than either. 1 condition, he said. Tell me. His voice was even, level, and it landed in her chest and stayed there. Don't fall in love with me. She said nothing. He handed her the contract. She didn't sign it then. She read it, every clause, every protection, every exit architecture. the way you read things when you know you're signing away something you might not get back, and you need to know exactly what the exchange is before your pen hits the paper. She signed it that afternoon. That night, sitting at the east-facing desk with her research materials spread before her, and the house quiet around her in Kong Tai Hyun, somewhere below in the parts of the house she hadn't yet mapped, she opened a new document on her laptop and titled it simply Private. She didn't write anything in it yet. She just left it open, because she already knew, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 11 months tracing the financial architecture of a man's secret generosity and come to understand the shape of him before she'd ever been close enough to feel the warmth of his hand. She already knew that the condition he'd named was going to be the hardest clause in the contract to keep. The question was only how long before he realized she'd already broken it. And somewhere beneath the house, in a room she wouldn't find for weeks yet, a door stayed closed over the thing he hadn't told her. The wound at the center of everything he'd built, the name he didn't speak, the reason the empire existed at all. The contract was 30 days. The damage was already done. The contract was 30 pages. Imani had read all of them, twice. She'd made notes in the margins of her own copy, questions, flag points, the 3 clauses she'd pushed back on before signing, and she'd filed the signed version in the waterproof sleeve inside her laptop bag, the way you filed documents you might one day need to produce as evidence of your own sanity. The first week inside Tae Hyun's house was an education in the specific texture of controlled silence. She had expected the security to be visible. Instead, it was architectural, the kind embedded in systems rather than bodies. The cameras she could identify were positioned with a logic she recognized from her research into private security infrastructure, covering angles rather than performing surveillance. The 2 men she'd noticed at the gala, she learned their names were Jin and Sergeant Park, the latter being both his actual surname and his actual former rank, moved through the house's perimeter on a rotation she tracked from the east window in the first 3 days without intending to. It was the researcher in her, the part that couldn't stop mapping what it moved through. Taehyun himself was harder to map. He was present in this house the way load-bearing walls were present, structurally, without announcement. He left early and returned at hours that varied without pattern. He ate dinner at the long dining table and did not watch his phone while he ate, which she found more unsettling than anything else she'd cataloged about him because it suggested either supreme self-discipline or a kind of internal quiet that she didn't entirely trust. He asked about her research twice in the first week, specific questions that demonstrated he had understood what she'd told him previously, and he listened to her answers with the same complete attention he appeared to bring to everything, which she found more unsettling still. They had their first real argument on day 9. It started, as most consequential arguments do, over something that was not actually the argument. She had been working at the east-facing desk, cross-referencing a set of foundation grant records with corporate registry data, when she hit a wall she'd hit before, a holding entity called Hoen Capital Partners, registered in the Cayman Islands, that appeared in the financial architecture of 14 different charitable organizations across Seoul with no discernible common originator. She'd been circling it for 8 months. Every approach she tried terminated at the same dead end. She was staring at the screen with the particular aggressive blankness of someone who had been staring at the same wall long enough to start hating it personally, when she heard Tae Hyun's voice from the hallway. Not raised, never raised, but carrying the specific frequency of someone delivering a decision that was not open for renegotiation. Reroute the Seorium transfer through the Jeju holding. Make sure the origination point is 3 layers removed before it hits the foundation ledger. A pause. Whoever he was speaking to was not in the hall. Earpiece then. I don't care what Beom-suk's accountant told him. The money is clean when it arrives. What it passes through to get there is not his business. Imani did not move from the desk. She heard him come to the doorway. She could feel that he'd stopped there without turning around. You're doing it again, he said. Doing what? That thing where you hear something and start processing it instead of reacting to it. Your shoulders go a particular way. She turned in the chair then. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed and his jacket already off. The gray shirt from this morning replaced with a dark one, and he looked at her with that steady look that by now she'd stopped trying to decode and simply endured. Hoen Capital Partners, she said. He didn't change expression. It's yours, she said. Not a question. The architecture of it had just rearranged itself with a click she could feel behind her sternum. 14 foundations. Identical structural distance from the originating entity. The money cleaning itself through enough layers that by the time it reached the children's funds and the medical programs and the community centers, it was untraceable. 14 foundations, Tae-hyun. You're the anonymous donor behind 14. This conversation goes in neither of our interests, he said. You told me full information. I told you enough information to understand what you were agreeing to. That's not the same thing, and you know it. She stood up. She wasn't angry yet. She was something more precise than angry. The thing you felt when a pattern resolved and the resolution was larger and more complicated than you'd been accounting for. How much? Total, across all 14. Imani, how much money are we talking about moving through organizations that you publicly have no connection to? His jaw tightened, fractionally. She'd learned to read the fractions. The numbers are not something I'm going to recite in a conversation that hasn't been vetted for. I'm not asking you to recite them. I'm asking you to confirm that what I think I'm looking at is what I'm actually looking at. She crossed her arms. Because if it is, then the money funding the Seorim Children's Fund, the one that was honored at the gala, the one whose director you are clearly in some kind of leveraged relationship with, ultimately traces back to the same source as everything else. And that means the charitable work and the criminal architecture are not separate things. They are the same organism. The hallway was quiet. Yes, he said. One word, flat and final, and carrying more weight in its brevity than a longer answer would have. Imani looked at him for a long moment. She could feel her own breathing, slightly elevated, consciously regulated. She did not let it show in her face what that one-word answer cost her to hear because she'd told him she wouldn't look away from what he was, and looking away included looking away from her own reactions to it. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay. I need to know one more thing. I reserve the right to refuse. The Seorim director, Shin Beom-seok, she held his gaze. The woman in the red dress. What happened to her after we left? Something moved in his face. Not guilt, not quite guilt, something adjacent to it. She's safe. She's been relocated to a city where Beom-seok's reach is limited and has been given the means to start over. By you. By resources I directed. Because she was telling the truth. Because she was going to be punished for it regardless of whether she was. Imani nodded. She sat back down. She turned back to her screen. Behind her, she heard Tae-hyun stay in the doorway for another moment, then move off down the hall, and she stared at the Hyun Capital Partners entry in her database and thought about the fact that she had just confirmed, beyond any research standard she'd been trained to apply, that the man who had clean anonymous money funding 14 children's charities across Seoul was running a criminal syndicate with the same hands. She did not write in the private document that night. She was afraid of what she would write. The first public appearance came on day 11. It was a dinner, private, 12 people, hosted by a man named Director Woo at a restaurant in Gangnam that didn't have a sign visible from the street. Imani had spent 3 days being briefed on who would be there and why by Tae-hyun's head of intelligence, a slight 30-year-old woman named Choi Da-eun, who delivered information with the efficiency of someone who had never once in her professional life wasted a word. Da-eun had also, without being asked, had 3 dresses delivered to the house in Imani's size. Does he do that for everyone? Imani asked. There's been no one else to do it for, Da-eun said, and left. Imani wore the dark green one. It fit, which was more than she'd expected from someone who'd sourced it without her measurements. And then she remembered that she was living in the house of a man who ran intelligence operations across the Korean peninsula and recalibrated her expectations accordingly. The dinner was an exercise in the specific endurance required for high-stakes performance. She had done versions of it before. Every black woman who had moved through academic spaces the way Imani had developed a version of this skill. The ability to sit in a room where you were not expected and perform capability and composure until the room adjusted its expectations around you. But this was a different kind of room and a different kind of performance, and the stakes attached to it were differently shaped. Director Woo was in his 60s, well-maintained with the particular warmth of men who had learned that warmth was more effective than coldness as a control mechanism. He asked her questions about her research with the specific quality of attention that told her he already knew the answers. She gave him clean, accurate versions of what she'd said in public settings, and watched him calibrate whether she was a liability or an asset, and could see, by the end of the appetizer course, that he had concluded the former. Taehyun sat beside her and said little. He didn't need to. He had the particular social skill of someone who understood that the most powerful position in most rooms was the one that required least demonstration. He let people come to him. They always did. Under the table, between the main course and the dessert, his hand found hers. It wasn't the staged contact of the gala. She understood the difference immediately. At the gala, it had been decisive and functional and pointed outward. This was different, quieter, directed at no audience, his thumb moving once across her knuckles in a way that was over before she'd fully registered it had happened. She looked at her plate and kept her face completely neutral and felt her heartbeat do something inconvenient. Afterward, in the car, he said, "You handled Wu well." "He's going to cause problems," she said. "Yes." "He's decided I'm a liability." He decided that before dinner. The question he was actually answering tonight was whether I'm losing my judgment. He looked out the window. He concluded I haven't. "How do you know?" "Because he shook my hand when we left and not yours. It means he's filed you under handled rather than threatening." Amani thought about this. That's a fine distinction. Most important ones are. She looked at him then, at his profile against the moving city light. He was doing the things she'd catalogued, looking at Seoul without really looking at it, present in the car, but processing something she couldn't access, his jaw carrying that specific tension that appeared whenever something was unresolved. "What was the first operation?" she said. The tension in his jaw became a different kind of stillness. "People don't ask that twice," he said. "I'm not most people. And you said full information." "I said enough information." He turned from the window. His eyes in the dark of the car were very direct and carrying something she hadn't seen before, so not anger, not warning, something rawer and less controlled than either. "There are things I will tell you when I decide to tell them. That is not tonight." She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. "Not concession, documentation." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the city. "The private document on your laptop," he said. Her stomach dropped. "I haven't read it," he said. "I want you to know that." She didn't ask how he knew it existed. She already knew the answer to that. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you should know that I know it's there, and that I won't." He paused. "Some things people need to keep for themselves. I understand that." She looked at her own hands. "Thank you," she said, which was smaller than what she felt, but more than she could afford to give. The self-defense session started on day 14. It was Taehyun's suggestion, and her agreement had been reluctant and practical in equal measure. Reluctant because the power differential of being taught something physical by a man whose capabilities she was still charting made her instincts uncomfortable. Practical because she had now been publicly identified as connected to him and had no illusions about what that meant for her personal risk profile. They used the lower level of the house, a room that was padded and mirrored and contained enough equipment to suggest it was used regularly for purposes beyond today's tutorial. He started with the basics: body weight, center of gravity, the architecture of how a larger person's force worked, and how to redirect it rather than resist it. He was a good teacher. She hadn't expected that either. He was clear and precise and made no assumptions about her starting point, which she appreciated, and he corrected without condescension, which she appreciated more. He showed her something once and then stepped back and let her work through it until she'd found her own understanding of it, only intervening when she'd developed a habit that would get her hurt. On the third session, she got frustrated. She'd been working on an elbow release, a specific grip that someone larger could lock her in from behind, and she kept breaking the mechanics at the same point, the same place her instinct overrode her training and she moved wrong. And after the 5th consecutive failure, she made a sound that was not polite. "Stop fighting the instinct," Taehyun said from behind her. "I'm trying to replace it." "You're fighting it. That's different." He stepped closer. "Can I show you?" She nodded. He put her back in the grip, his arms coming around her from behind, and this close she could feel the solidity of him, the genuine physical weight of it, and she made herself stay present in the mechanics of the lesson rather than in the proximity. "Your instinct is to pull forward," he said. His voice was even and close. "Don't. Let it arrive. Let yourself feel how it wants to compress you, and then use that. Turn into it instead of away. She stopped fighting the grip. She let herself feel the full pressure of it. Then she turned, using her body weight the way he'd shown her, and felt the architecture click. She broke the grip cleanly. There was a silence. She turned to face him. He was looking at her with something that had come loose from his usual expression, something more present and less controlled. And they were close enough that she could see the scar along his left jaw that she'd been peripherally aware of for weeks without letting herself look it directly. "Good," he said. His voice was exactly the same. The something in his face cleared itself. She turned away before either of them had to decide what to do with the moment, and they went back to the mechanics, and neither of them mentioned it. But that night she opened the private document and wrote 3 words and closed it again without reading back what she'd written. It was on day 17 that the syndicate's internal tension became impossible to ignore. She'd been aware of it building, the quality of the phone calls she overheard, the way Jin and Sergeant Park moved through the house with a different frequency by the end of the second week. The meetings Tai Hyun had been taking in a ground-floor room with a closed door that she didn't approach. She'd been giving it space because she understood that the organizational consequences of the gala were still resolving, and because she had enough research discipline to know the difference between information she needed and information that wasn't hers to have. But on day 17, Choi Da-in came to her directly. She knocked, and came in and sat down without being invited, which was the first time she'd done any of those things, and she placed a photograph on the desk beside Amani's laptop. It was taken from a long distance, telephoto, slightly grainy, and it showed a man leaving what appeared to be a parking structure with 2 other men. One of the 2 was someone she didn't recognize. The other was someone she did. "That's Lee Jun-ho," she said. "He's one of Tae Hyun's. He's inner circle. Second in command for Eastern Operations," Da-eun said. "He's been with the organization for 11 years. Amani looked at the photograph. At Lee Jun-ho leaving a parking structure with a man whose identity she didn't know, but whose posture and positioning in relation to the others suggested authority. "Who's the one in the center?" "Representative of the Chongsan Group." Da-eun's voice was very even. "They are the primary rival organization in the northern districts. They've been trying to absorb Black Phoenix's operations for 3 years. Amani sat very still. "Does Taehyun know?" "He suspects. He doesn't have confirmation." A pause. "I'm telling you because you need to understand what the next 2 weeks inside this house are going to look like, and because you have a particular skill for understanding architecture. You're asking me to look at this. I'm giving you information you are already adjacent to." Da-eun stood. "What you do with it is your own decision." She left the photograph. Imani stared at it for a long time. Then she pulled up the financial database and started running the same structural analysis she used for charitable foundation forensics. Except this time she was looking at the operational financial footprint of the Chongsan Group and its intersections with organizations she'd previously mapped as adjacent to Black Phoenix's territory. It took 4 hours. What she found at the end of those 4 hours made her push back from the desk and put her hands flat on the table and breathe. The Chongsan Group's expansion into Black Phoenix territory wasn't new. It had been building for 8 months. And the financial corridor they were using to fund the move, the capital they were routing through front businesses to support the operational push, it was passing through a set of shell entities that she recognized. She recognized them because she had mapped them previously, because they appeared in the outer architecture of the Hyun Capital Partner Network, which meant someone inside Black Phoenix had been funding a rival's expansion using the organization's own redirected capital. Lee Jun-ho had been bleeding the syndicate from the inside for 8 months. She stood up. She went downstairs. She found Tae Hyun in the ground floor room with the closed door, and she knocked twice and opened it without waiting. He was at a table with Jin and 2 men she didn't recognize, and he looked up at her entrance with an expression that had something dangerous in it that receded when he saw her face. "Out," he said to the room, quietly. They went. She put the photograph on the table. She put the printed network map beside it. She put the financial trail summary on top of both, and she stood back. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without touching any of it, and she watched his face, and what moved through it was not surprise. It was confirmation of something he'd been refusing to fully believe, the moment when a suspicion becomes a fact and the fact requires a response you've been holding at bay because you didn't want the suspicion to be right. His jaw was very tight. How long did this take you? He said. 4 hours. Dayun. She gave me the photograph. The rest was mine. He looked at the financial map. This connects Junho directly to the Cheongsan corridor. 3 degrees of separation, enough to explain in a courtroom, more than enough for your purposes. She paused. He's been at it for 8 months. The capital volume suggests this isn't exploratory. He has an agreement with them. He's been guaranteed a position. Taehyun's hand, resting flat on the table beside the documents, became very still. She'd seen that particular stillness in him before, in the moments before he made a decision. It was not the stillness of a man calming himself. It was the stillness of a mechanism reaching operational readiness. You didn't have to bring this to me, he said. You're protecting me, she said. That requires you to be intact. He looked up from the documents and at her, and whatever he was feeling in that moment had too many components for his controlled face to fully contain, and she saw something flicker through it that he would have, in any other moment, kept in the place where he kept things. Imani. His voice was low. What I'm going to have to do about this, I know. It won't be clean. I know that too. She held his gaze. I told you I wasn't going to look away. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, long enough to become something else. And then he picked up the documents and walked to the door, and she heard him speaking into his phone before he'd reached the hallway, his voice dropping back into the professional register that left no room for anything personal. She stood in the empty room alone. She looked at the space where he'd been standing. Then she went upstairs and opened the private document and began to write, really write, for the first time. Not 3 words and a closing, but the full shape of what was inside her, the thing the contract had forbidden, and the month was more than half gone, and she had put herself in the path of a man's security detail at a charity gala because she couldn't look away from injustice. And she couldn't look away from him either, and she'd known it, she realized. She'd known it for 11 months, since the first time she'd traced the financial architecture of his anonymous generosity and found herself thinking about the hands behind it at 3 a.m. when she was supposed to be. She didn't finish the sentence. The document was still open on her screen, cursor blinking at the end of the incomplete thought, when she heard the sound from below. Not loud, not the kind of sound that announced itself as significant, just a single sharp impact followed by a silence that was a different quality than the silence before it. The kind of silence that meant something had changed in the architecture of the house. Imani closed the laptop. She sat still for 4 seconds, running inventory on what she could hear. Nothing from Jin's usual position near the east stairwell, nothing from Sergeant Park's rotation pattern she'd mapped in the first week, nothing from the ground floor room where Taehyun had been making calls. Nothing was wrong in the way that nothing being wrong was itself wrong. She stood up, and she moved to the door in her socks because heels on this floor announced you from 20 feet, and she opened it 2 inches and listened. The hallway was empty and lit and completely, incorrectly quiet. She had spent enough time in this house to know its sound, the specific ambient frequency of a building with 6 people moving through it at various distances, the particular acoustic signature of security rotation, the refrigerator cycle in the kitchen below that ran every 40 minutes. All of it was absent. She was hearing the house the way you heard a body when the heartbeat stopped. The structure still present, the animating current gone. She went down the stairs. She found Jin on the ground floor near the east corridor, sitting against the wall with his hand pressed to the side of his head and blood coming through his fingers at a rate that was manageable but not good. He saw her, and his expression did something that was trying to be reassuring and landing closer to grim. Where? She said. Taehyun got them into the south room. There are 4. He pulled his hand away from his head to look at it, put it back. Park is outside. They came through the garden entrance. Someone gave them the rotation. Junho. Had to be. She pulled her phone, no signal. She looked at Jin. Jammed. Yeah. How long ago? 6 minutes, maybe 7. She did the math on what 7 minutes of 4-on-1 looked like, and stopped doing the math because the math was not useful. She looked at Jin's head wound. She looked at the east corridor. She looked at the direction of the south room, which she had never been inside, which had always been the closed door at the end of the hall that she had respected without being asked to. Can you walk? She said. Can walk. Can't be useful for a few minutes. Stay here. She moved. She did not have a weapon. She had spent 14 days learning how to break a grip and redirect force and use her body weight effectively against a larger opponent, and she had nothing else. And she moved down the east corridor toward the south room with her back near the wall and her breathing as controlled as she could make it, and her mind doing the thing it did under pressure, going very clear and very cold and processing only what was immediately necessary. She heard his voice before she reached the door. Already sent the documentation. That was Tae-hyun, even. A door couldn't fully contain that voice. Burning me doesn't get you what he promised you. It gets you a very short window before the counter-movement closes it. A different voice, one she didn't know. The window's long enough. For what specifically? For us to move the Seorim accounts before your people freeze them. For the Cheongsan transition to complete. For Junho to collect what he was promised. A pause. He's not in this room, is he? He sent you. Silence from the other voice. He sent 4 of you, Tae-hyun said, which means he's either underestimating me or he wanted this to be survivable for someone, which means he's not burning the relationship entirely, which means his arrangement with Cheongsan isn't as solid as he told them it was, which means enough. A third voice now, harder than the second. We're not here to debate his logistics. Then what are you here for? The access codes for the Hewn network, all 14 foundations. We transfer the capital, we walk out, you get to keep breathing. Amani was at the door now. It was not fully closed, a 3-inch gap, which was either careless or deliberate, and she couldn't tell from this angle. She looked through the gap. The south room was not what she had imagined. She had told herself, in the 3 weeks she'd lived in this house, that she hadn't been curious about the closed door. She'd been lying to herself. She'd been deeply, specifically curious, and in the idle spaces between research sessions, she'd constructed versions of it. A security operations center, a weapons room, a space full of the visible infrastructure of criminal enterprise. It was none of those things. It was a memorial. The walls were covered, carefully, completely, with photographs and framed playbills and handwritten notes pinned under glass. A dancer, in image after image, caught mid-motion in the specific suspended grace of someone who had spent their entire life learning to make the body defy its own weight. Young, maybe 20 in the earlier photographs, older in the later ones. Always in motion or just finished with it, the energy still visible in the frame. In the center of the room there was a single table with a single framed photograph and a small collection of objects. A pair of worn ballet slippers, a ribbon, a folded program from a performance. And in front of that table, with 2 men positioned to his left and one behind him and one near the door that Amani was looking through, Tae-hyun stood with his hands at his sides and his face doing something she had never seen it do. He was not afraid. That wasn't it. He was standing in the room the way you stood at the center of the thing that had already destroyed you once. And the particular quality of his stillness was not the operational stillness she'd cataloged across 3 weeks. It was the stillness of someone for whom this specific room was the location of the thing they could least afford to lose, and who was losing it anyway. The codes, the hard voice said. No. The man behind Tae-hyun moved. It was fast and efficient and professional, and Amani saw it happen and felt her body make the decision before her mind had caught up, and she pushed the door open and walked into the room. Everyone looked at her. In the half-second of collective recalibration, she crossed the distance to the man nearest her, the one by the door, who was closest and who had turned fully to look at her, which meant his weight was shifted and his center of gravity was cooperative. And she did the thing Tae-hyun had shown her. She let the instinct arrive, and then she turned into it instead of away, and she hit the man's wrist at the precise angle that disrupted the grip he was reflexively reaching for. And she moved past him and put herself between him and the table with the ballet slippers on it. The room was very still again. Tae-hyun was looking at her. His expression had gone through 3 things in under 2 seconds and arrived at something she couldn't name. Well, the hard voice said. He was the second largest man in the room, late 40s, with the specific patience of someone for whom violence was a professional tool rather than an emotional one. He looked at her the way you looked at a variable you hadn't planned for. The fiancé. The fiancé, Amani confirmed. Her voice came out even. She was almost impressed again. You want to step out of this room. I'm fine where I am. Miss Brooks. That was Taehyun. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. This is not the situation for... I heard the conversation, she said. I know what they want. She looked at the hard-voiced man. The Huon capital codes. 14 foundations. Total capital transfer. She looked back at Taehyun. Don't give them the codes. Imani. The money in those foundations represents 8 years of infrastructure, 14 communities. She didn't look away from him. Don't. The hard-voiced man made a sound that might have been reluctant appreciation. She knows what this is, he said to Taehyun. Interesting fiancé. Relocate her, Taehyun said. His voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard before. Not cold, something that was past cold, on the other side of it. Take her out of this room and put her somewhere, and I'll discuss the codes. No, Imani said. Imani. The warning in his voice had an edge. No, she said again, and she held his gaze and put everything she had into it. Every piece of research she'd done, every thread she'd traced, every anonymous foundation grant she'd mapped, all of it, everything. And she watched him receive it and watched the edge in his expression become something else entirely. 8 years, she said. Don't. Something happened in his face. It was the thing she'd been watching for across 3 weeks, the thing behind the controlled expression, the thing she'd suspected was there from 11 months of tracing his financial generosity through 17 degrees of corporate separation. It surfaced now, in this room, surrounded by this particular violence, with the ballet slippers on the table behind her and the walls covered in the face of someone he had failed to save. He looked at the hard-voiced man. If I give you the codes, he said, you have the capital. You have enough operational leverage to complete the Cheongsan transition. You don't need her. Correct. And Junho gets what he was promised. That's not your concern. I'm making it my condition. Taehyun's voice had gone to the register she recognized from the night of the gala, the one that didn't need volume. She walks out of this building before I give you anything, uncontested. The hard-voiced man looked at Imani. He looked at Taehyun. He looked at the man near the door whose wrist Imani had disrupted and who was looking at her with an expression that was reassessing something. Fine, he said. Taehyun. Her voice cracked on his name, just slightly. She held the rest of it together. Don't. He looked at her, and for the first time across 3 weeks and a signed contract and every controlled exchange in between, he looked at her without any of the regulation in place. He looked at her the way the private document had looked when he told her he knew it was there and hadn't read it, like something he was choosing to protect, even though protecting it cost him. Go with Jin, he said. He's in the East Corridor. Go. The codes don't save you. They just go. Not a command, a request. The difference was in the frequency of it, and she heard the difference, and it was the difference that moved her feet. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned back and looked at the room, at the photographs on the wall, at the dancer frozen in motion in image after image, at the ballet slippers, at the program. At Taehyun standing in the center of his own memorial to failure with 4 men around him and his hands at his sides. I know what this room is, she said quietly. His jaw tightened. I'm coming back, she said. She left. Jin was upright by the time she reached him, managing something more functional than he'd been managing 10 minutes ago, and she put his arm over her shoulder and they moved toward the garden entrance because the east stairwell felt wrong now. They made it to the garden wall and Jin found his phone in his jacket pocket, a secondary, not jammed, and made 2 calls in rapid succession that she didn't listen to because she was looking back at the house. The south room's window was lit from inside. She thought about what she'd seen on those walls. She had spent months researching Kang Taehyun through financial architecture, and financial architecture told you the shape of a person's choices, but not the shape of the thing that made them choose. She had found the charitable fingerprint and traced the anonymous generosity and built a structural picture of a man who was doing terrible things and using them to fund something that looked, from the outside, like conscience. She had not known what conscience looked like from the inside until she saw a room built to hold it. 20 minutes later, 3 cars arrived through the garden gate. Not police, not emergency services. Men she recognized as the outer ring of Black Phoenix's security structure, who moved with direction and without wasted motion. Jin talked to two of them in rapid Korean that she didn't catch all of. One of them looked at her and then looked away in the way that meant he'd been told who she was. And then Tae-hyun walked out of the house. He was not visibly injured. He walked the way he always walked, with that even, controlled gait that gave nothing away. But she'd been living in proximity to him for 3 weeks, and she knew by now where he kept the things he was carrying, and he was carrying something tonight that was heavier than operational damage. He saw her. He stopped walking. She crossed the garden to him. "The codes," she said. "The transfer has been frozen." His voice was level. Dae-yun had a secondary block in place on the Hyun network. They got a partial, enough to make the exchange feel real while she locked the rest. "They'll know." "Yes. By morning." "Which means Junho knows his arrangement just collapsed." "Yes." She studied his face. "You planned this." "Dae-yun planned it. I gave her the architecture 6 days ago when I first suspected the meeting was being arranged." He paused. "I didn't plan for you to be in that room." "I know." "You could have been—" "I know," she said. "I was there anyway." He looked at her, and again the thing happened that she was starting to stop being surprised by. The control coming fractionally loose, the something behind it visible, the specific quality of a man confronting the fact that something he'd categorized had refused to stay in its category. "The room," she said. "The dancer. Who was she?" The garden was quiet. The men with the cars had given them space without being asked. Tae-hyun looked at the ground for a moment. His jaw worked. When he looked back up, something was different. Something had been decided in the brief interval of looking down, and the decision had cost him, and he was going to make it anyway. "Her name was Seo Yeon," he said. "She was 26. She was the best person I have ever known." Amani was quiet. "She was a dancer with the national company. 8 years ago, before the syndicate, before any of this, she became the target of a smear campaign run by the organization that controlled the performance venue's funding. They wanted her out because she refused to sign a contract that gave them 60% of her future earnings, and she had enough profile that her refusal was visible. So they destroyed her visibility." His voice was very even, too even, the kind of even that was structural. Photographs, fabricated accusations, anonymous reports to the company's board. They were systematic, and they were effective, and I had resources, even then, enough to begin fighting it, but I wasn't fast enough. He stopped. "She was killed in a car accident 3 months into the campaign. The official finding was driver error." He paused. "It wasn't driver error." The garden air was cool. Amani stood very still. "The syndicate," she said carefully, "is built on what came after. It's built on the infrastructure I constructed to dismantle every organization that was connected to what happened to her, to take apart their capital, their leverage, their reach." His voice didn't change. "And to make sure no one else inside their network could do to someone else what they did to her. That is the first operation. That is what no one asks about twice." He said the last sentence without emphasis. "Just placed it." Amani thought about the 14 foundations, the orphanages and the medical funds and the community centers and the children in yellow raincoats. She thought about a medical debt paid when she was 16 and her mother was dying of something her family couldn't afford. She thought about the shape of a man's grief translated across 8 years into the most complex, anonymous infrastructure of generosity she had ever mapped. She thought about him standing in that room tonight with 4 armed men around him and his hands at his sides and his face doing that thing she'd never seen it do. And she understood now what she'd been looking at. He had built an empire over a grave, and he tended both with the same hands. Tae-hyun. He looked at her. She reached into the pocket of her jacket. She pulled out her phone. She opened the private document, the one he'd told her he knew existed and hadn't read, and she held it out to him. He looked at the phone. He looked at her. "You said you wouldn't look away," he said. "I'm not looking away," she said. "I'm showing you what I was looking at." He didn't take the phone immediately. He looked at her for a long moment in the garden light, and what moved through his face was something she didn't have a clean word for. Not surprise, past surprise, the thing after surprise when you've processed it and arrived somewhere more complicated. He took the phone. He read it. She watched him read it, watched his eyes move across whatever she had written at 3 in the morning in a voice she'd never intended him to hear. The accumulation of 3 weeks and 11 months, and the warmth of his hand, and the self-defense sessions, and the dinner in Gangnam, and the word fiancé landing in a ballroom like a stone in water. When he finished, he looked up. His face was doing several things simultaneously, none of which the controlled expression was fully managing. He opened his mouth. His phone rang. Not the primary, the secondary, Jin's model, the unblocked one. He answered it because the specific ringtone meant it was Da-Eun, and Da-Eun only called the secondary in a situation that overrode everything else. He listened for 11 seconds. She watched his face go through the thing that was past cold and come out somewhere she had never seen him arrive. "Where?" he said. He listened. "How long ago?" He listened again. "Lock the Seorim accounts, all of them. Pull Park in from the perimeter, and—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Say that again." Whatever Da-eun said again made his hand tighten on the phone until the knuckles changed color. "The private document," he said, "on her laptop, upstairs." His voice was absolutely flat. "When?" He lowered the phone. He looked at Imani, and for the first time in 3 weeks, the careful machinery behind his eyes was fully offline. Not damaged, not compromised, simply gone, replaced by something that was naked and direct and had nothing to protect itself with. "Junho wasn't working for Chung-san," he said. She felt the air change. "He was working for Director Wu," he said. "The dinner, 11 days ago. Wu had your dissertation materials scanned from the research bag you left in the coat room. He's known for 10 days what you know about the Hun network. He's known everything you've been working on." He paused. "And he leaked it. Tonight. To 3 journalists and 2 law enforcement contacts he owns." Imani's mouth went dry. "Your research, your name, your analysis, your financial mapping of the Hun network. It's going to be in the morning edition of 2 newspapers as the work of an academic collaborator who helped a criminal organization launder philanthropic capital." He said it flat and complete, the way you said things that were already done. "They've constructed the story as yours, the 14 foundations, the capital movement, the shell entities, attributed to your methodology, your authorship." She heard the words. She heard them land. She understood, with the complete and nauseating clarity of someone whose entire academic architecture had just been weaponized against her and published under her name. That her dissertation, her career, her credibility, her years, all of it had just become the evidence of a crime she had not committed, would be indistinguishable from the documentation of one she had. And somewhere in the house behind them, on her east-facing desk, her laptop held the private document he was still holding her phone open to, and the private document held everything she felt, and by morning her name would be attached to everything she knew, and the 2 things together would make her exactly the weapon Wu needed to dismantle Kang Tae-hyun from the outside, while Junho had been working to dismantle him from within. She had been the architecture of the trap the entire time. She had walked into this house with a research bag and 14 months of financial forensics, and she had handed Wu everything he needed to destroy them both, and she hadn't known, and not knowing didn't change what the morning was going to look like. Tae-hyun was still looking at her. She looked back at him with her dissertation and her reputation, and the private document and the warmth of his hand all arriving in the same moment, and she said the only thing that was true enough to say, "Tell me what we do now." And the look on his face told her that for the first time in 8 years of building an empire over a grave, Kang Tae-hyun did not have an answer ready, because the person standing in front of him asking the question was the first variable he had not known how to. He didn't have an answer ready because she was the first variable he hadn't planned for. That lasted 4 seconds. Then Kang Tae-hyun put her phone in her hand, closed her fingers around it, and walked back into the house. And she followed him because standing in the garden alone was not a category of option she was willing to occupy. Daeun was already inside at the ground floor table with 2 laptops open and 3 phones arranged in a row, and the specific expression of someone managing a cascade failure with the tools available, which were not sufficient but would have to be. She looked up when they came in and looked at Imani with something that was not quite apology and not quite anything else. And Imani understood that Da-eun had known about the coat room and the research bag and had not known in time. "The journalist," Tae-hyun said. He didn't sit. He stood at the end of the table and looked at the screens. Who are they running with? Lee at the Herald and Park Sung-min at the Independent Digital. Both have the package. Both received it 2 hours ago. Da-eun's voice was flat and operational. The law enforcement contacts are Prosecutor Hwang's office. He's been looking for a way into the Hyun network for 3 years. If Woo gave him Imani's mapping with her name on it, he has enough to open a formal investigation by morning. Can we pull the package? From Lee, possibly. Park Sung-min already filed the digital version. It went live 40 minutes ago. She paused. I found it when I was running the secondary lock on the foundations. Imani stood very still. It's already published. A partial version. The full print edition isn't until morning. Da-eun looked at her directly. The digital version has your name, your university affiliation, and a summary of the Hyun network mapping attributed to your research methodology. It's framed as an exposé, an academic who uncovered a criminal philanthropic laundering scheme and brought the documentation forward voluntarily, making me look like I cooperated with the criminal investigation, or ran it. The framing is ambiguous enough to function either way, depending on what Woo needs it to do. Imani sat down. She hadn't planned to. Her legs made the decision independently, the body registering the weight of things before the mind had finished processing them. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. Her research. 8 months of forensic financial mapping, built with academic rigor, built with the specific care of someone who understood that evidence needed to be airtight before it was used. Weaponized. Published under her name. Attributed to a collaboration she had never entered and could not disprove because the methodology was genuinely hers. The fingerprint of her analytical approach was embedded in every line of it. Who needs the Hyun network, she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised. The foundations. He doesn't actually care about me or the story. The story is leverage. Taehyun looked at her. He published it to create a clock, she said. Once the investigation opens, the Hyun accounts get frozen as evidence. That locks the foundation capital in legal limbo. Could be years before it moves again. The communities those foundations fund lose access to the money, regardless of whether any charges are ever filed. She looked up. He doesn't need to prove anything. He just needs to freeze everything. Dayan was looking at her with an expression that had recalibrated slightly from its baseline. How do you stop the investigation from opening? Imani said. We remove the predicate, Taehyun said. The investigation opens because Hwang has documentation of the network structure and evidence that a named individual compiled it. If we can demonstrate that the documentation was obtained illegally and the attribution is fabricated, Hwang loses his predicate. How long does that take? Legally? Weeks, months. He paused. There's another way. She looked at him. Woo's leverage over Hwang, he said. He owns 3 of Hwang's decisions in the last 4 years. Those decisions have documentation. If that documentation reaches Hwang's superiors before morning, Hwang becomes the investigation instead of opening one. You have it. I've had it for 2 years. I kept it because a Hwang who owed Woo was more useful than a Hwang who'd been replaced by someone I didn't have information on yet. He said it without apology, the plain arithmetic of how he operated. I didn't plan to use it this way. But you'll use it. Yes. Imani looked at the table. She thought about the specific moral weight of what he'd just described, using documented corruption to stop a corrupt action, the leverage game running in both directions, the city operating entirely in the space between laws rather than inside them. She thought about 14 foundations, about children in yellow raincoats, about a medical bill paid when she was 16. What do you need from me? She said. I need you to call Park Sung-min, he said. The journalist, tonight. She looked up. And say what? That the documentation he received was stolen from your research files without your knowledge or consent. That the attribution to your methodology is accurate, but the framing is fabricated. That you are prepared to provide a counterstatement with supporting evidence. He'll want to know why I'm telling him instead of through a lawyer. Because it's 11:30 at night, and lawyers take until morning, and by morning the print edition runs, and the investigation opens, and the clock Woo set becomes irreversible. He looked at her steadily. You would know the right way to talk to him. I don't. She understood what he was doing. He was giving her a function that was hers, using her language, her credibility, her voice in the way it had value that his didn't, in the space that his organization couldn't reach. He was asking her to walk into this as a partner rather than a protected variable. The contract said fiancé. This was something more specific than that. "Give me his number," she said. Dae-Yun slid a phone across the table with the number already on screen. Imani called it. Park Sung-min answered on the second ring because journalists who'd just published something significant didn't sleep, and his voice had the specific quality of someone already braced for the incoming consequence of whatever they'd just filed. "Mr. Park," she said, "my name is Imani Brooks. You published a story 40 minutes ago that uses my name." A silence. Then, "Miss Brooks." Carefully, "I'm going to tell you 3 things," she said. "First, the research methodology attributed to me in your story is genuinely mine. I did build the analytical framework that was used to map the Hue network. That part is accurate. Second, I did not provide that documentation to you or to whoever sent you the package. It was stolen from my research files. Third, the framing of my role in that story is fabricated by a party who wanted to use my academic credibility to open a legal action that serves his financial interests." Another silence. Longer this time. "That's a significant claim. I know. I'm making it anyway because it's true and because you are a journalist who presumably prefers to publish accurate things." She paused. "I can provide you with timestamp documentation of my research process, email chains establishing the timeline of when my files were accessed without authorization, and a formal counterstatement by 6 a.m., if you're willing to hold the print edition pending verification of the attribution." She could hear him breathing. "Who accessed your files?" he said. "I'm prepared to tell you that on record in a formal interview tomorrow. Tonight, I need the print edition held." She held the phone and waited and looked at Tae-Hyun across the table, and he was watching her with that complete attention she'd cataloged from the beginning, the kind that didn't miss anything. "I'll need to call my editor," Park Sung-min said. "I'll stay on the line." He put her on hold. She sat with the phone against her ear and her other hand flat on the table and her heartbeat doing something that was not panicked but was not calm, the particular intermediate state of someone running on the edge of what they had available and declining to look down. Tae-Hyun stood up quietly and moved to the other side of the room and began speaking to Da-eun in low, rapid Korean that she didn't try to follow. She kept her breathing even and waited. 7 minutes. Park Sung-min came back. "The print edition will be held pending an independent verification of the attribution claims. I'll need your formal statement by 5 a.m. "You'll have it," she said. She lowered the phone. She looked at Tae-Hyun. He looked back. "One down," she said. "One down." He was already moving. "We have 4 hours before the secondary clock runs. Wu will know the print edition was pulled within the hour. He has a contact at the paper. When he knows, he accelerates. He'll go to Hwang directly and push for the investigation opening without waiting for the morning edition. So we need the documentation on Hwang in Hwang's superior's hands before Wu can make that call." "Yes." "How?" "I know where the deputy commissioner is tonight," Da-eun said. "He's at a late dinner in Itaewon. He will have his secondary phone, the personal one, not the office line." "You're going to call the deputy commissioner of the Seoul Metropolitan Police at midnight," Imani said. "No," Tae-Hyun said and picked up his jacket. "I'm going to go see him." She stood up. "I'm coming." "Imani, you just used my credibility to hold a print edition. I'm not sitting here while you go negotiate with a police commissioner at midnight." She held his gaze. "Full information, full partnership. That was the agreement." He looked at her for a beat that stretched longer than necessary. "Don't get out of the car until I say," he said. The drive to Itaewon took 11 minutes. The city outside was running at its late-night frequency. Still lit, still moving, the streets populated by the particular mix of insomnia and nightlife that Seoul sustained past midnight without apology. Imani sat in the back beside Tae-Hyun and did not look at him and felt the warmth of him in the car's close space and thought about the private document and the way his face had looked when he read it and filed all of it in the part of herself that she was managing separately from the operational emergency. Jin was in the front with the secondary driver. His head had been properly bandaged at some point in the last hour. He looked like a man who was running past his capacity on principle, which she respected. The restaurant was called something she didn't catch from the car window. Small, dark-windowed, the kind that catered to people who needed to eat late without being visible doing it. Tae-hyun got out. He went inside. She counted minutes. 14 minutes later, he came back out. He got in the car. His face was doing the past cold thing. Hwang already called him, he said, 20 minutes ago. The investigation is opening at 7 a.m., regardless of the print edition. The car was very quiet. Did he take the documentation? She said. He took it. He'll act on it. A pause. But not fast enough. Hwang has enough independence to open the preliminary investigation without the deputy commissioner's direct authorization. By the time the corruption documentation process is through the review structure, the Hyun accounts will already be frozen. Imani looked at her hands. Her brain was running the architecture of it, the timeline, the pressure points, the places the system could be interrupted. There was one she'd been circling since the table and not raising because it required something she wasn't sure she had standing to offer. My name is already in the digital version, she said. Yes. And the investigation is opening based on documentation that uses my analytical methodology. Yes. If I go to Prosecutor Hwang directly, she said, and provide a sworn statement that the documentation was compiled without my knowledge or consent, and the attribution is fabricated. That's not a lawyer's filing. That's a witness statement from the named individual in the predicate evidence. He can't disregard it without compromising his own procedural standing. Tae-hyun looked at her. It slows the investigation opening, she said. Maybe not stops it, but slows it. Buys Dawn time to push the corruption documentation through a different channel. She paused. I'd be walking into a prosecutor's office at 1 a.m. and making a statement that implicates Director Woo in evidence fabrication, which means Woo finds out tonight that I went there, which makes you a direct threat to him, Tae-hyun said. His voice was very flat. Instead of a piece of architecture he was using. Yes. He will respond to that as a threat. I know. Imani. He turned in the seat to look at her fully, and his voice had the thing in it from the garden, the thing past operational, the thing underneath the controlled frequency. If you walk into Hwang's office tonight, you are not protected by the contract anymore. You are a principal. Everything that comes after. I know what comes after. She held his gaze. I told you I wasn't going to look away. That includes not looking away from the part where I'm the fastest solution. Something broke in his face. Just slightly. Just enough. He looked at her for a long moment in the back seat of the car with Seoul running past them both, and the clock at 3 hours and 40 minutes until 7 a.m. If you do this, he said, I cannot guarantee. I'm not asking you to guarantee anything. She looked at him steadily. I'm asking you to drive me to Hwang's office. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he looked at Jin. Prosecutor Hwang's office, he said. Jin didn't ask questions. The car moved. Prosecutor Hwang was not at his office at 1:15 in the morning. The duty officer who answered the after-hours line was 22 and visibly unprepared for a foreign woman identifying herself as the named individual in a case his prosecutor had opened 90 minutes ago, requesting an emergency witness statement. It took Imani 4 minutes on the phone to get him to patch through to Hwang's personal line. Hwang answered with the voice of a man who had been expecting a call, but not this call, and she could hear in the quality of his alertness that he was recalibrating in real time. Ms. Brooks, he said, this is unexpected. I'm outside your building, she said. I have a witness statement regarding the documentation you received tonight that I believe materially affects the predicate of any investigation you're considering opening. A pause. It's past 1 a.m. The investigation opens at 7. I'm here now. She kept her voice level. If you open an investigation based on fabricated attribution, and I can demonstrate that you had the opportunity to verify the attribution before opening it and declined, that affects the investigation's legal standing and your professional record. I don't think that's what you want. A longer pause. Give me 15 minutes, Hwang said. She gave him 15 minutes standing on the pavement outside the building with Tae-hyun 3 feet to her left, and Jin on the corner, and the city running its indifferent late-night frequency around all of them. The air was cool, and she was still in the dress from earlier, and she could feel the specific physical exhaustion that arrived not from exertion, but from sustained high-stakes presence, the kind that settled into the back of your neck and the base of your sternum and reminded you that the body had been running at emergency capacity for hours. Taehyun took off his jacket and put it around her shoulders. He did it without ceremony, without asking, just did it, and put his hands back at his sides. She didn't say anything. She looked at the building entrance and felt the warmth of the jacket across her shoulders, and catalogued it in the place where she kept the things she wasn't going to examine right now. Hwang came down himself, which told her he was either very confident or very worried, and she'd learned enough in the last 3 weeks to read the difference. He was worried. He looked at her. He looked at Taehyun on the pavement behind her, and something moved in his expression that was not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of a suspicion about the shape of the evening. "Ms. Brooks," he said. "Thank you for coming down," she said. "I'll be brief." She gave him 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, she laid out, with the precise structured clarity of someone who had spent 8 years training her brain to present complex, evidentiary chains to academic committees, the full timeline of how her research had been accessed, the methodology of how her analytical fingerprint had been lifted and applied to a documentation package she had not compiled, and the specific party who had orchestrated the package's delivery to both him and the journalists. She named Director Wu, by name, on record, to a prosecutor. Hwang listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions. 2 of them were good questions, the kind that tested the internal consistency of what she'd said, not the kind that tried to find the exit. The 3rd question was, can you provide the documentation supporting the unauthorized access claim? By 5 a.m., she said. He looked at her for a moment. He looked past her at Taehyun on the pavement. The investigation opening will be delayed pending verification of attribution, he said. Not warmth, not hostility. The flat professional voice of someone who had just recalibrated his position and was proceeding accordingly. I'll expect your documentation by 5. He went back inside. She turned around. Taehyun was looking at her, and his expression had the thing in it again that she kept seeing and kept not having a name for. The thing that was not admiration, because admiration was something you felt from a distance, and this was something else, something that required proximity, something that had been building for 3 weeks, an assigned contract, and a room full of photographs of a dancer he'd built an empire over. The documentation, she said. Her voice came out slightly unsteady for the first time tonight, and she let it, because it was 1:50 in the morning, and she had just given a witness statement implicating a criminal power broker to a prosecutor by name, and her reserves were not what they'd been at the start of the evening. Dae-yoon has it, he said. She's been compiling it for the last hour. She knew I'd do this. She suspected. His voice was quiet. I should have. She looked at him. What does Woo do when he finds out? Taehyun didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with that level directness that she'd learned to read as the precursor to something he'd decided to say fully rather than partially. He'll move tonight, he said. He can't wait for the legal process anymore. You've turned it against him. He needs to resolve this operationally before 5 a.m. She understood what operationally meant. He's going to come for me directly, she said. Yes. Taehyun's voice was very level. Which is why we are not going back to the house. The car was already moving before he'd finished the sentence, Jin having received something through the earpiece that had changed the direction of their travel without instruction, the way things moved in Taehyun's orbit, before the spoken word, already responding to the changed pressure. Imani felt the jacket still around her shoulders. She felt the city changing as they drove, the neighborhood shifting in character the way Seoul did when you moved fast through it at night. The lighting changing, the density of street life thinning. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. We have Lee Jun-ho. She showed it to Tae-hyun. He looked at it. His jaw did the thing. Da-yoon, he said to Jin. Jin made the call. Dayan's voice came through the speaker, and what she said in the next 45 seconds rearranged everything again, because Junho had not simply been working for Woo. Junho had been building a separate documentation package of his own for the last 8 months, a parallel record of every financial decision Tae-hyun had made, every capital movement, every foundation transfer, intended as his exit insurance if the Chungson arrangement fell through. And Junho, cornered and abandoned by Woo after the failed house operation, had made a call. To a federal organized crime division, not the Metropolitan Prosecutor's Office. Federal. The level that operated above Hwang, above the deputy commissioner, the level that Wu's reach didn't touch because it was the level that had been quietly building a case against Wu himself for 4 years. Junho had offered them everything: his 8 months of documentation, his direct testimony, his knowledge of Wu's operational structure, in exchange for a cooperation agreement. And the Federal Division's first response had been to send the forward message to the phone number Junho had given them as his first point of contact. Taehyun's secondary number, the one Imani was holding. She looked at the phone. She looked at Taehyun. "They contacted you first," she said. "They contacted the number Junho gave them," he said. Something was moving in his expression that she hadn't catalogued before. Something that was arriving at him the way convergence arrived. Multiple separate forces meeting at a single point. The point being now. The point being the back of this car. The point being her holding a phone with 4 words on it that meant the entire architecture of the last 3 weeks had just found its resolution. And the resolution required him to walk through a door he had spent 8 years keeping closed. Cooperating with federal organized crime investigators meant the empire ended, not destroyed, transformed, turned over. The intelligence, the documentation, the 8 years of built infrastructure pointed outward rather than inward. 8 years of building. Everything Seo Yeon's death had generated. Turned. His hand, resting on his knee in the back seat of the car, was very still. She reached out and put her hand over his. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the gesture didn't already contain. His hand turned under hers. His fingers closed. Outside the car, Seoul kept running. Indifferent, lit, relentless, the city that didn't have an off switch moving at its own frequency. While inside a single black car, 2 people sat with their hands closed around each other, and the weight of an 8-year empire pressing on one of them, and the weight of a demolished academic career pressing on the other, and the choice that would determine what both of their lives looked like pressing on both of them simultaneously, and the clock on the dashboard reading 2:47 in the morning, with 5 a.m. arriving whether they were ready for it or not, and Director Wu somewhere in this city, making the call that would send men toward them before the hour was out, and Junho somewhere in federal custody, waiting to see if the number he'd given them produced a response, and the response sitting in Imani's hand in 4 words, and the weight of everything that followed them, and Taehyun's face in the car doing the thing she had no clean name for, and his hand warm and certain around hers. And the moment before the answer stretched longer than it should have, because some moments did that, expanded to contain everything they were required to hold. And then his phone lit up with Da-Yun's name, and he looked at it, and looked at Imani, and she nodded once, and he answered it and said the words that could not be taken back, that turned the empire, that opened the door he'd kept closed for 8 years. His voice completely steady in the way that things were steady when the decision was already made, and what remained was only the execution of it. And outside the car, Seoul ran on, and somewhere across the city, Director Wu's phone was ringing with news that the architecture he'd spent months constructing had just inverted itself completely and was now pointing directly at him, and the 5 a.m. clock was ticking. And Imani Brooks sat in the back of a car in a borrowed jacket with her hand in the hand of the most dangerous man she had ever known and felt, underneath all of it, underneath the exhaustion and the demolished career and the federal case opening and the threat of Wu's operational response still moving toward them through the dark city. The things she had written in the private document at 3 in the morning when she thought no one would ever read it, still true, more true. The truest thing in the car, and possibly the truest thing she had ever written, which was that she had stopped being afraid of him somewhere between the self-defense sessions and the south room and the warmth of his hand. And what she felt instead was something she had no intention of taking back even if the contract expired tomorrow, even if everything else did too, even if the morning brought everything it was promising to bring, which was considerable, which was everything, which was already on its way. The call lasted 6 minutes. Tae-hyun spoke in Korean for most of it, and Imani didn't catch everything, but she caught enough. The formal register shifting into something more direct in the final minute. A name repeated twice that she recognized as the Federal Division's senior investigator from the briefing Da-Yun had relayed through Jin's phone. When he ended the call, he sat for a moment with the phone in his hand and his thumb resting on the dark screen, and she watched him stay with whatever the 6 minutes had cost him before he put the phone in his jacket pocket and looked at her. "It's done," he said. 2 words. The weight of 8 years in them. She didn't say anything. She kept her hand in his and let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not comfortable, simply honest. The silence of something large having moved. Jin received coordinates through his earpiece, and the car changed direction without anyone in the back seat being asked, which was correct, because neither of them was in a position to decide where they were going yet. They were in the position of people who had just restructured everything and needed 30 seconds to let the restructuring settle before the next thing arrived. The next thing arrived in 20. Dayan's voice through Jin's phone. Wu's men left his compound 14 minutes ago. 2 vehicles. They're not going to the house. The house is being monitored by federal assets now. They'll know that. They're going somewhere else. Where? Taehyun said. A pause that lasted 3 seconds and felt like longer. Park Sung-min's building, Da-yoon said. The journalist. Amani's hand tightened around his. He thinks the story still runs if he pressures the source directly, she said. Her voice had the cold clarity that arrived when fear metabolized into something functional. He doesn't know Sung-min already agreed to hold the print edition. He thinks if Sung-min is unavailable by morning, the digital version stands alone and the investigation opens on schedule. And if Sung-min can't provide a counterstatement because he's been removed from the situation, Taehyun was already talking to Jin before he'd finished the sentence. The car accelerated. They were 12 minutes from Sung-min's building. Wu's vehicles were 14 minutes out, probably less depending on route. Imani called Sung-min. He answered on the first ring, still awake, still in his office based on the ambient sound. Get out of your building, she said. Now. Don't go home. Go somewhere with people. She paused. I'll explain everything in the morning. Leave now. A silence. Then, how serious? Serious enough that I'm calling you at 3 a.m. to tell you to move. She heard his chair. She heard him stand. Okay, he said, and the line went quiet. She lowered the phone. Taehyun was looking at her. He's moving, she said. He nodded once. The car kept moving through the city. What happened in the next 2 hours was not clean. She had known it wouldn't be clean. He'd told her it wouldn't be clean, back in the garden. And she'd said she knew, and she had known it intellectually. The way you knew things before they arrived in the body. What she hadn't fully accounted for was what not clean actually looked like from inside it. Wu's men reached Sung-min's building and found it empty, which bought 11 minutes, during which they relayed back to Wu and Wu recalibrated. And the recalibration produced a decision that Da-eun intercepted through channels Imani didn't have the context to fully understand, but that resulted in 3 sharp Korean sentences from Da-eun through Jin's phone and Taehyun saying one word back and Jin taking a turn that felt like a decision. They stopped on a block in Mapo that Imani didn't know. A building that from the outside looked like a commercial office space, and from the inside, she got as far as the ground floor lobby, looked like the operational center she'd expected when she first moved into the house. Clean, lit, functional, staffed by 4 people at screens who looked up when they came in and looked back at their screens without comment. Dayan was already there on a screen, remote, her face in the top corner of the largest monitor. Wu is making a direct call to the federal division, Da-yoon said. He's offering his own cooperation agreement. He's going to try to get ahead of Junho's testimony by offering a broader package first. Can he? Imani said. Legally, yes. The federal division will take the better information offer. Da-eun paused. Whether his information is actually better than Junho's is a different question, but the division won't know that until they've heard both. Which means the first one to the table with the most complete package gets the cooperation agreement, Taehyun said. Yes. Imani looked at the screens. She looked at Taehyun. Something had clarified in her mind with the specific sharpness of a solution you'd been circling for hours, finally resolving. The Hune network documentation, she said. My version. The complete analytical mapping, not the stolen partial that Wu gave to the journalists, but the full 8-month research package. Every shell entity, every capital flow, every degree of separation between the originating source and the 14 foundations. She looked at Taehyun steadily. If I give that to the federal division directly, the complete version, with my academic authentication and the full methodology, It's more comprehensive than anything Wu can offer, because Wu only has the partial version his people pulled from the coat room. He doesn't have the last 3 weeks of analysis I've done inside your house. The room was very quiet. You'd be giving a federal organized crime division the complete financial map of Black Phoenix's philanthropic infrastructure, Taehyun said. His voice was level. Entirely level. Voluntarily. You already called them tonight and offered cooperation, she said. The map is part of cooperation. And my version, the academic version, fully authenticated, makes Wu's partial version look like what it is, a stolen fragment used to fabricate a narrative. She held his gaze. It also demonstrates that the documentation was mine, and the attribution was real, but the framing was fabricated, which kills his predicate, which protects Sung Min, which protects the foundations from being frozen as criminal evidence rather than processed as cooperative disclosure. He looked at her for a long time. If you do this, he said, your research becomes federal property. The dissertation is already in a newspaper under a criminal fraud framing, she said. I'd rather it be in a federal cooperation file under my own name and my own terms. She paused. And the foundations stay operational. He held her gaze. She held his. The children in the yellow raincoats, she said quietly. Not a manipulation, just the truth of it, placed where it belonged. Something moved through his face that was finished with being controlled about it. He looked at Da-eun on the screen. Get me the Federal Division Senior Investigator. The call to the Federal Division Senior Investigator, a woman named Director Lim, who answered her phone at 3:40 in the morning with the voice of someone who had not been sleeping, lasted 22 minutes. Amani spoke for 14 of them. She laid out the complete analytical framework, the 8-month timeline, the methodology, the authentication chain. She offered the full documentation package as voluntary cooperative disclosure under her own name, attached to Taehyun's cooperation agreement in advance of anything Wu could bring to the table. Director Lim asked 4 questions. All 4 were excellent. At the end of the call, she said, we'll need the full package by 5 a.m. and your in-person signature on a cooperation disclosure form by 9. You'll have both, Amani said. She lowered the phone. Her hand was shaking slightly. Not from fear, from the sustained expenditure of everything she had, the body registering what the mind had been too occupied to acknowledge for the last 4 hours. She pressed her palm flat on the desk until it stopped. Taehyun crossed the room to her. He didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers on the desk, the same way she had put her hand over his in the car. The gesture given back, the weight of it shared in both directions now. They stood like that for a moment. The screens ran. Daeun's face was in the corner of the monitor, and she was already compiling the documentation package with the efficiency of someone who had anticipated this outcome 40 minutes before it happened. Woo, Amani said. Director Lim's division will move on him this morning, Taehyun said. Once our cooperation package is filed, his offer becomes less valuable than the prosecution of him. He knows it. He'll know it when he finds out Lim took our call before his. He paused. He'll move against us before he accepts that. How much time? An hour. Maybe less. She nodded. She was tired in a way that had texture. She could feel the specific weight of each hour that had elapsed since the gala, could feel the dress she'd been wearing since 9 p.m., and the borrowed jacket and the pavement outside Huang's building, and the cold air of the car and the warmth of his hand. She was tired, and she was clear, and the two things were coexisting in her the way they sometimes did when you were past the point where exhaustion could blur anything important. Tell me about her, she said. He looked at her. Seo Yeon, she said. Tell me something about her that isn't in the room, something you keep somewhere else. He was quiet for a moment. She thought he might not answer. It was the kind of thing that could go either way, and she wouldn't have pushed it, because some things people needed to keep in the place where they kept things, and she understood that and had told him so. But he answered. She laughed at the wrong moments, he said. His voice was quiet and had no performance in it. Serious scenes, important meetings, moments that required gravity. Something would strike her as absurd and she couldn't hold it. She'd have to leave rooms sometimes. A pause. I spent years trying to cultivate the kind of stillness that held rooms together, and she'd dismantle it in 30 seconds by finding the wrong thing funny. Yes. He stopped. I didn't tell her often enough that it was one of the things I loved most about her. Imani looked at her hands on the desk. You've been still for 8 years, she said. He didn't answer. The answer was in the way he didn't answer. The room was beautifully kept, she said. Everything was cared for. The slippers, the program. She looked up at him. She knew you cared for things. He looked at her with the expression that had no clean name. The things I care for tend to end up in danger, he said. It wasn't self-pity. It was inventory. The plain accounting of what the evidence suggested. Or they end up in federal cooperation agreements at 4 a.m, she said. Depending on the thing. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the place a smile had been threatening to arrive at for 3 weeks, and had kept stopping just short of, and this time it didn't stop. It arrived, briefly, real, the first completely unguarded thing she'd seen on his face since the night of the gala. It lasted 3 seconds. Then Dayan said his name from the screen and it was over, but the 3 seconds had happened and she put them where she kept things. Wu made his move at 4:17. It wasn't men this time. It was a filing. His legal team, operating on his instruction, submitting an emergency injunction to freeze the Hyun Capital partner accounts, pending criminal investigation, routed through a circuit court judge whose name appeared twice in the corruption documentation Tai Hyun had given the deputy commissioner. The judge signed it. The accounts froze at 4:22. Dawson had the freeze notification at 4:23 and was on 3 phones simultaneously at 4:24, and Tae-hyun was reading the injunction document at 4:25, and Imani was looking at the screen showing the 14 foundation accounts locked in legal hold and thinking about everything held inside them. The medical programs and the community centers and the school buildings and the children in yellow raincoats, and feeling something that was not panic, because panic wasn't useful and also was not acceptance, because acceptance of this specific outcome was not something she was prepared to arrive at. The corruption documentation, she said. The deputy commissioner. He needs until morning to process it through the review structure, Dae-eun said. The judge who signed the injunction is protected until the documentation reaches the oversight committee. How long? 9 a.m. at the earliest. The foundations need operating capital by 8, Tae-hyun said. He was looking at the screen with the operational stillness, the mechanism reaching readiness stillness. The Busan Clinic has a supply delivery at 8. The Incheon Community Center has a payroll transfer due. If the accounts are frozen through 9, there's a secondary reserve, Dae-eun said. You established it 4 years ago. It's not under the Hyun structure. A pause. It's under a personal holding registered to an individual named Kong Tae-hyun, which means it's not covered by the injunction against the Hyun network. He looked at the screen. It's your personal capital, Dae-eun said. Not the syndicates. Never was. Imani looked at him. He held the look for a moment. Then he said to Dae-eun, transfer the operating shortfall from the personal reserve to the foundation accounts directly. Document every transfer as personal charitable contribution. Timestamp everything before 5. That puts your personal finances directly in the disclosure record, Dae-eun said. Yes, he said. Do it. Dae-eun did. At 4:51, with 9 minutes before the documentation deadline, Imani sent the full research package to Director Lim's secure file portal, authenticated under her own academic credentials. With a cover letter she wrote in 11 minutes that was the most precise thing she had ever written. Every word doing exactly what it was there to do. Nothing wasted. The case for her authorship and the fraudulent reframing and the cooperative nature of the disclosure built with the same forensic care she'd brought to 8 months of financial mapping. She sent it and sat back and breathed. Tae-hyun was beside her. He'd been beside her for the last hour in the particular way he was beside things, present without imposing, attentive without performing. He looked at the sent confirmation on the screen. It's enough, he said. Not reassurance, assessment. It's enough, she said. It was enough. Director Lim's division moved on Wu at 6:45 in the morning, 45 minutes before his injunction was scheduled to produce its intended effect. The arrest was not televised. It was not performed. It was the specific quiet efficiency of a federal operation that had been building its case for 4 years and simply finished building it. And the last piece it needed had arrived in a file portal at 4:51 a.m., under an academic's name and credentials. The circuit court judge who had signed the injunction was removed from the bench by 8:15, the corruption documentation having processed through the overnight review structure faster than Da-Un had projected, because the deputy commissioner had apparently decided that 9 a.m. was a more comfortable timeline than his integrity required and had moved at 6. The Hyun accounts unfroze at 8:49. The Busan clinic received its supply delivery at 9:02, 11 minutes late, which the clinic coordinator noted in the delivery log without knowing the 11 minutes had anything behind them. Amani signed the cooperation disclosure form at a federal building in central Seoul at 9:15, seated across a table from Director Lim, who was 53 and had the kind of face that had spent decades making accurate assessments of people and no longer needed much time to do it. She looked at Amani across the table and said, before any formal paperwork began, "Your methodology is exceptional." "Thank you," Amani said. "We'll want to discuss your research access going forward," Director Lim said, "in a formal capacity, with appropriate compensation and legal protection." Amani looked at the table. She thought about her terminated research assistant position and the dissertation that was now embedded in a federal cooperation file and the career she had been building in one direction for 8 years that had just, overnight, become available in a different direction entirely. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "Take your time," Director Lim said, and meant it, and they proceeded to the paperwork. Taehyun was in the federal building's lobby when she came out. He was sitting in one of the chairs with his jacket on, and his hands loose in his lap, and he looked like a man who had been sitting there for a while and had decided that sitting there was exactly where he intended to be. He looked up when she came through the door. She sat down in the chair next to him. "Lee Jun-ho," she said. "Cooperation agreement confirmed. He'll testify against Wu's network in exchange for reduced charges and relocation." He paused. "He asked if I would... He wanted to know if I..." He stopped. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it." He looked at his hands. "He was with me for 11 years. He sat across from me at a table in this organization every week for 11 years and smiled and delivered reports, and I trusted him, and he was building a parallel record the entire time." A pause. "I don't know what to do with 11 years." "You don't have to know today," she said. He looked at her. "Is that from personal experience?" "It's from watching you not know what to do with 8 and managing to build 14 children's foundations in the middle of not knowing." She held his gaze. "You figure it out. It's what you do." He looked at her for a long moment. The federal building lobby was moving around them. People arriving, departing, the ambient sound of institutions conducting their necessary business. And they were still in the middle of it the way they'd been still in the back of the car. The city moving around a specific stillness that the two of them were making together. "The contract expires in 9 days, he said. She looked at the lobby floor. "I know. I've been thinking about the language of it," he said. "The specific clause structure, the exit provisions." And he reached into his jacket pocket. He produced the contract, her copy, the one she'd kept in the waterproof sleeve, which meant he'd gotten it from her laptop bag at some point in the night, and she would have been more alarmed about that under different circumstances. He tore it in half, cleanly, deliberately. The paper made a sound that was satisfying in the way that definitively ending things sometimes was. Then he held the two halves. "I'm not good at this," he said. His voice was quiet and had no architecture in it, no operational register, no professional distance, just the voice of a man saying a true thing in a lobby at 9:30 in the morning after the longest night of several years. "The contract was easy. Contracts have language. I know how to inhabit language." "I know," she said. "This doesn't have language." "No." He looked at the torn halves in his hands. "You told me not to fall in love with you," she said. "You said it as a condition." "Yes." "That was very optimistic of you," she said, "given everything." The corner of his mouth moved again, the place where the smile lived. "I read what you wrote," he said, "in the document." "I know. I've read it 3 times. She looked at him. And I want to say something to you that isn't in a contract and isn't a condition and isn't a warning." He met her eyes. "You walked into a room with 4 armed men to stand in front of a table with ballet slippers on it. You called a journalist at midnight and a prosecutor at 1 in the morning and a federal director at 3:40, And you did all of it in a dress you'd been wearing since 9 p.m. And my jacket. Sam. He paused. And at some point in the middle of all of that, you also wrote 3 pages in a private document about the warmth of my hand. She said nothing. Her chest was doing something inconvenient, and she let it. I have been still for 8 years, he said. I built the stillness because the alternative was everything falling apart, and I could not afford for everything to fall apart because the organizations I was dismantling didn't stop operating just because I was in pain. He stopped. You are the first thing in 8 years that has made me want the alternative. The lobby moved around them. Tai Hyun, she said. I'm not finished. She waited. Seo Yeon deserved better than I gave her, he said. I was too slow and too proud, and I believed I had more time than I did, and I've carried that every day for 8 years, and I will continue to carry it because it is mine to carry, and it is right that I do. His voice was even and direct, and had the specific gravity of something that had been sitting at the bottom of a person for a long time being brought to the surface and spoken with full weight. But I have also been using it, he said, using it to stay in the stillness, because the stillness was safe, and the stillness didn't require me to be someone who could lose someone again. He looked at her. You made that not viable. You did that gradually and then all at once, and I don't think you were particularly trying to. I wasn't trying at all, she said. It happened because you kept doing things I couldn't account for. Like what? Like taking your jacket off and putting it around my shoulders on a pavement at 2 a.m. without saying anything about it. She looked at him steadily. Like telling me you knew the document existed and hadn't read it. Like the way you stand in rooms. She stopped. Like the foundations. All of it. The entire shape of what you built. He looked at the torn contract in his hands. He set both halves down on the chair beside him. I don't know what the organization looks like from here, he said. The federal cooperation changes the structure. Some of it transitions to legitimate operations. Some of it dismantles. It will take time and the process is not going to be without cost. He paused. I'm going to be navigating that for a long time. I know. And you have a federal division offering you a formal research role in forensic financial analysis of criminal philanthropic networks, which is genuinely the most specific job description I have ever heard, but it is also exactly what your research has been about for the last 2 years. I haven't decided yet, she said. You've decided, he said. Not a challenge. The observation of someone who read people the way she read financial architecture, thoroughly, without missing what was actually there. She thought about it. She thought about Director Lim saying your methodology is exceptional, with the particular flatness of someone who rarely said things they didn't mean. She thought about 8 months of forensic mapping that had started as a dissertation chapter and ended as federal evidence. She thought about the career she'd been building and the direction it had been heading and the direction last night had revealed it could go instead. I've decided, she admitted. He nodded, a small, real nod. Then we are both, he said slowly, in the process of becoming something different from what we were when this started. Yes, she said, and neither of those things requires the other person to go away. She looked at him. The lobby light was morning light now, the 9:30 quality of it, and it did the same thing to him that the east-facing window had done to her room on the first morning in his house, made everything very clear. No, she said. Neither of those things requires that. He reached out and took her hand. Not the staged contact of the gala. Not the grip under the table of the Gangnam dinner. Not the warmth in the car of the earlier parts of the night. This was simply his hand and hers in the morning light of a federal building lobby with the torn contract on the chair beside him and everything they'd both been before last night, also partly on that chair, in a different way. She let herself feel it, the full weight of it, without the contract, without the condition he'd named, and she'd already broken before the ink dried. She let it arrive in her the way he'd taught her to let things arrive in the self-defense sessions. Not fighting the instinct, not trying to replace it, turning into it instead of away. It was very warm. Somewhere across the city, 14 foundations were operational and funded and serving the communities that had been built to hold them, and a clinic in Busan had received its supply delivery 11 minutes late without knowing why. And a dancer named Seo Yeon had photographs on a wall in a south room that would continue to be tended with care, and Director Wu was in federal custody. and Lee Junho was somewhere making the calculation of what his testimony would cost and what it would return. And Park Sung-min was already writing a different story than the one he'd been given, one that would run in the morning edition and tell the shape of the night accurately and under the right names, and Amani's dissertation was going to become something larger and stranger and more specific than she had planned for it to be. And none of it was clean, and none of it was the version of any of their lives that had been in place before a charity gala in March, before a stranger's hand in front of 500 witnesses, before a signed contract and a torn one, and a private document and 3 pages about the warmth of a hand. She tightened her fingers around his. He tightened his around hers. Outside, Seoul kept going, relentless, lit, entirely itself. The city that did not have an off switch, that had been running at various intensities through everything this night had contained and would continue running through everything that came after, indifferent and enormous and indispensable, the way cities were, the way the world was, requiring you to move through it at whatever cost and find, somewhere inside the moving, the thing worth holding on to. She had found it. She was holding it. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.